The expensive bourbon felt cold and sticky as it trailed down my neck, ruining the $3,000 silk gown I'd bought specifically to make him proud. "You're making a scene, Sarah," Mark snapped, his voice a low, dangerous growl that didn't match the casual way he held his mistress's waist in front of the most powerful families in Greenwich. The girl, a 24-year-old blonde named Tiffany I had personally vetted to be his junior associate, didn't even have the decency to look away. She just smirked, her fingers tracing the exact diamond tennis bracelet Mark had told me was a corporate gift for a client. I stood there, the silence of the country club ballroom ringing in my ears like a physical blow, while the neighbors we'd grilled steaks with for a decade suddenly found their shoes very interesting. How did the man who held my hand through 3 rounds of IVF become the stranger humoring a crowd by baptizing me in cheap whiskey? It started with the Silicon Valley hours, or at least that's what he called them, when his tech consultancy firm started taking off. We had the quintessential American dream, the sprawling colonial in Connecticut, 2 beautiful kids, and a golden retriever that actually sat on command. Mark was the visionary, the guy who could sell ice to an Arctic explorer, and I was the one who kept the engine greased, managing the books, the house, and the public image that made him look like a stable family man. But about 6 months ago, the image started to crack. The late-night strategy sessions became the norm, and his phone, which used to sit openly on the kitchen counter, was suddenly glued to his palm or face down like it was hiding a bomb. I remember the first night I let myself wonder if I was being the crazy wife. It was a rainy Thursday in October. Mark was supposedly in a late-night board meeting, but when I went to fold his laundry, I found a receipt in his suit pocket for a boutique hotel in Manhattan, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and a no-questions-asked vibe. When he finally rolled in at 2 a.m., smelling like a mix of wood smoke and a perfume that was far too sweet to be mine, I showed it to him. He didn't even blink. He leaned against the doorframe, unbuttoning his shirt with a tired sigh, and told me it was a room he'd booked for a consultant from out of town who'd had too much to drink. He looked me dead in the eye and asked if I was starting to lose my grip on reality because of the housewife isolation. He was so gaslighting proficient that I actually apologized. I spent the next month trying to be the cool wife, the one who didn't ask questions, the one who kept the kids quiet so daddy could rest. I convinced myself that in a town like ours, every successful man had a little bit of a midlife crisis, and as long as he came home to me, I could weather it. I leaned into the domesticity, organizing the school's annual fundraiser and making sure his favorite craft beer was always in the fridge. I chose to stay in the dark because the light was starting to look like a forest fire I couldn't put out. The turning point was the Black Tie and Diamonds Gala for our children's private academy. Mark was the guest of honor, the man who had donated a new library wing. I was standing by the silent auction when I overheard 2 of the moms whispering behind a floral arrangement. One of them mentioned the little blonde at the office and how bold Mark was being, taking her to the city for lunch at Le Bernardin, while his wife was busy running the PTA. My heart dropped into my stomach. It wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was public knowledge. I was the last person in the zip code to know that my marriage was a punchline. I didn't scream. I didn't cause a scene right then. I walked to the bar, ordered a double, and watched him across the room. He was laughing, his head tilted back, looking every bit the American success story. Then she walked in. Tiffany. She wasn't wearing an intern's outfit. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, and on her wrist was the corporate gift bracelet. Mark didn't even try to hide it. He walked straight to her, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and kissed her. Not a polite peck, but the kind of kiss you give someone you're obsessed with. When I finally walked over to them, my legs felt like lead. I didn't have a plan, just a burning need to see the look on his face when he was caught. But Mark didn't look caught. He looked annoyed. He looked at me like I was a smudge on his expensive shoes. "Sarah, you're looking a bit tired," he said, loud enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "Maybe you should head home before you embarrass yourself." When I reached out to grab his arm, demanding he explain himself, he pulled back, grabbed Tiffany's bourbon, and threw it right in my face. The room went dead silent. Tiffany giggled, a tiny, sharp sound that broke something inside me. As I stood there, dripping and humiliated, I realized Mark hadn't just cheated. He had decided to replace me. But what he didn't know was that while he was busy playing King of the Hill with his new queen, I had spent the last week talking to the one person who knew where all his offshore accounts were hidden. I spent the car ride home from the gala in a state of icy, vibrating silence, the smell of bourbon clinging to my hair like a brand of shame. Mark didn't even drive back with me. He stayed behind to apologize for my behavior, leaving me to navigate the winding roads of Greenwich through a blur of tears and fury. When I finally walked through the front door of our dark, silent home, I didn't go to the master bedroom. I went straight to the guest bathroom and scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to wash off the feeling of Tiffany's smirk and Mark's public betrayal. I kept telling myself this was a nightmare, that tomorrow he'd wake up, blame the stress of the tech merger, and beg for my forgiveness like he had a dozen times before over smaller things. I was still in the self-deception phase, clinging to the wreckage of a 10-year marriage because the alternative, being a 36-year-old divorcee with 2 kids and a shattered heart, was too terrifying to face. Mark didn't come home until 5 in the morning. I heard his heavy footsteps on the stairs, and for a moment, I considered staying under the covers and pretending to be asleep, but the anger was a living thing now, clawing at my throat. I met him in the hallway, still wearing my bathrobe, my eyes red and swollen. I asked him how he could do that to me, how he could throw a drink in my face in front of our friends, our neighbors, the people who saw us as the perfect couple. He didn't even look guilty. He looked bored. He leaned against the wall, smelling of expensive cigars and that same cloying perfume, and told me that I was the one who made it weird. He said my manic energy and insecure hovering were becoming a liability to his professional reputation. He looked me in the eye and said, "Sarah, you're losing it. Everyone at the club sees it. I'm trying to protect you, but you're making it impossible." He was so calm, so rational, that for a split second I actually wondered if I was the problem. Maybe I had been too clingy. Maybe I had let the stress of the kids' school applications get to me. This was the trap Mark was so good at setting. He'd twist the truth until it looked like a noose, and then he'd ask why I was struggling to breathe. I spent the next 2 days in a fog of self-soothing, telling myself that men in high-power positions just needed more space. I watched him play with our son, Leo, in the backyard, laughing as they kicked a soccer ball around, and I tried to convince myself that a man who loved his children this much couldn't be a monster. I convinced myself that Tiffany was just a temporary distraction, a shiny new toy he'd eventually get bored of once the novelty wore off. I even went as far as to buy him a new set of golf clubs as a peace offering, a desperate attempt to buy back the man I used to know. But the universe has a way of poking holes in a lie when you're trying too hard to believe it. On Monday morning, while Mark was in the shower, his work phone, the one he usually guarded like a state secret, was sitting on the dresser. It buzzed with a calendar notification. I shouldn't have looked. I should have walked away and kept my head in the sand, but the curiosity was like a fever. I swiped the screen and my heart stopped. It wasn't an email from a client. It was a shared calendar invite for our special anniversary at a jewelry boutique in Soho. The date was for this afternoon. The location was the same place that had sold the mermaid's tear pendant I'd seen on Tiffany at the gala. When he came out of the bathroom, I was standing there with the phone in my hand, my fingers trembling. I didn't even have the strength to yell. I just asked him why there was an anniversary invite for today when our anniversary wasn't for another 4 months. Mark didn't panic. He didn't even try to grab the phone. He just smiled, a cold, predatory thinness to his lips, and told me it was for a client's wife, a concierge service his firm provided for top-tier investors. He told me I was snooping like a common thief, and that if I didn't stop, he'd have to reconsider our living arrangements for the sake of the kids' mental health. The threat was subtle, but it hit me like a physical punch to the gut. He was telling me that if I didn't stay quiet, he'd take the house, the kids, and everything I had built my life around. I spent that afternoon sitting in my car 3 blocks away from the boutique in Soho. I told myself I was just checking, that I'd see him walk in with a client and I'd feel like a fool and we'd go back to normal. But at 2:15 p.m., Mark's black SUV pulled up to the curb. He didn't get out with a client. He got out and opened the door for Tiffany. She was wearing a white summer dress that looked like a wedding gown, and she was glowing. They walked into the store hand in hand, laughing, and through the glass window, I watched as the jeweler brought out a tray of diamond rings. Not pendants, not bracelets, rings. I watched him slide a massive emerald-cut diamond onto her finger. I watched him kiss her deeply, right there in the middle of the store, with more passion than he'd shown me in 5 years. The realization hit me then. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a second life. He was planning to replace the old model with a newer version, and he was using the money we had saved for the kids' college funds to do it. I felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea. I leaned over and threw up in the passenger seat of my car, the taste of bile and betrayal filling my mouth. I didn't confront them in the store. I was too broken, too exposed. I drove back to Connecticut in a trance, my mind racing through every lie he'd told me over the last year. Every late night at the office, every business trip to Austin, every time he told me I was imagining things. He had been auditioning my replacement while I was at home making sure his shirts were pressed. When I walked into our house, the golden retriever wagged its tail at me and I burst into tears, sliding down the kitchen wall. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my marriage anymore. I was fighting for my survival. I pulled out my laptop and searched for the name of the most ruthless divorce attorney in the state, someone Mark wouldn't see coming. I needed an ally, someone who didn't care about image or Greenwich standards. But as I was about to click send on an inquiry, the front door opened and Mark walked in looking jubilant. "Great news, Sarah," he said, tossing his keys on the counter. "The merger went through. We're going to be richer than we ever dreamed. I want to take the kids and go to the Hamptons this weekend to celebrate. Just the four of us, no distractions." He looked so sincere, so loving that for a second, I almost believed him again. Until I looked at his hand and saw a faint smear of Tiffany's pink lipstick on his thumb. He was setting me up for something, and the quiet weekend wasn't a celebration. It was a trap. The drive to the Hamptons was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Mark sat in the driver's seat of the Navigator, one hand on the wheel and the other occasionally reaching over to pat my knee, playing the part of the doting American husband to a terrifyingly perfect degree. He sang along to the radio with Leo and Marta, promising them ice cream and beach bonfires, while I sat in the passenger seat, feeling like a ghost haunting my own life. Every time his hand touched me, I felt a jolt of electricity. Not the good kind, but the kind that makes your skin crawl, because you know those same fingers were sliding a diamond onto another woman's hand just 24 hours ago. I looked out the window at the passing Maryland coastline, realizing that Mark wasn't just a liar. He was a sociopath who could switch between a second family and his real one without a single glitch in his programming. We arrived at the beach house, a sprawling gray-shingled estate that we'd bought to celebrate our 10th anniversary, and the air was thick with the scent of salt and false promises. Mark was being attentive Mark, the version of him that had won me over in college, making me margaritas and telling me how much he appreciated me holding down the fort during the merger. It was the ultimate self-soothing trap. He was giving me exactly what I wanted, so that when I finally found the courage to accuse him, he could point to this weekend and say, "See, you're delusional. I'm right here." But I wasn't the same woman who had apologized for finding a hotel receipt. I had spent the night before downloading his cloud drive onto a hidden encrypted folder, and what I'd found was far worse than a simple affair. By Saturday afternoon, the mask began to slip. Mark claimed he had to take a crucial conference call regarding the final signatures for the merger and retreated to the upstairs study. I waited 10 minutes, then told the kids to go play in the pool. I crept up the stairs, my heart thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. The door was cracked just a hair. I didn't hear business talk. I heard Mark's voice, low and intimate, the way he used to talk to me when we were first starting out. "I know, babe," he whispered into the phone. "The Hamptons house will be yours by the end of the month. I just have to finalize the mental health evaluation for Sarah. Once she's in the facility, the trust triggers and we're clear. Just hold on a little longer." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet. He wasn't just replacing me, he was planning to institutionalize me to get full control of the assets we'd built together. He was using my paranoia about his cheating as the foundation for a legal claim that I was unfit. This wasn't just a betrayal of the heart, it was a total erasure of my life. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in jagged gasps, and retreated to the kitchen. I needed a witness. I needed someone who wasn't under Mark's thumb. I called my best friend, Julia, who had married into a family of high-powered New York litigators. "Julia," I whispered, my voice shaking so hard I could barely form the words. "He's trying to commit me. He's with her, and he's trying to steal the kids." "Don't do anything stupid, Sarah," Julia warned, her voice sharp and focused. "If he's setting a legal trap, you need a counterstrike. Do you have proof of the girl in the ring?" I told her about the Soho boutique, and she told me to stay put and act normal until she could get a private investigator to the house. But the act normal part died the moment Mark walked down the stairs, looking refreshed and triumphant. He walked over to me, poured himself a drink, and said, "You know, Sarah, I was thinking, you've been so stressed lately, maybe you should see that specialist Dr. Aris recommended. Just for a checkup. I've already made the appointment for Monday." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the coldness behind the smile. "Is that the appointment where you tell him I'm crazy so you can move Tiffany into my house, Mark?" The words were out before I could stop them. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face didn't crumble. It hardened. He set his glass down on the marble counter with a deliberate click. "I don't know who Tiffany is," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "But this is exactly what I'm talking about. The delusions, the names you're making up. You're scaring the kids, Sarah." "I saw you in Soho," I hissed, stepping into his space. "I saw the ring, I saw the kiss. I have the receipts from the mermaid's tear, and I have the logs from your private server." For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by a terrifying rage. He stepped toward me, his shadow looming over the kitchen. "You've been spying on me? After everything I've given you? You're ungrateful, and you're sick." He grabbed my wrist, his grip like a vice. "You're going to that doctor on Monday, or I'll make sure you never see Leo or Marta again. Do you understand me? I have the best lawyers in the country. You're just a housewife with a vivid imagination." He pushed me back against the counter, and for the first time in our marriage, I felt a genuine threat of physical violence. But then, a flash of red light caught my eye through the window. A car was pulling into the long driveway. It wasn't the private investigator, it was a red hatchback, the same one I'd seen at the office. Tiffany had followed him to the Hamptons. She stepped out of the car, looking agitated, holding a folder. She didn't see me through the window, she only saw Mark. She marched toward the front door and started pounding on it. Mark turned pale. He looked at me, then at the door, his carefully constructed world colliding in real time. "Stay here," he commanded, but I was already moving. I beat him to the door and flung it open. Tiffany stood there, her eyes wide, her expensive dress wrinkled. She looked at me, then at Mark behind me, and threw the folder at his chest. "You lied to me," she screamed, her voice cracking the suburban quiet. "You told me the divorce was finalized. You told me she was already in the hospital. Your lawyer just called me. The bank froze the accounts because of a suspicious activity flag. Where is my money, Mark?" I looked at the folder. It was a set of pre-signed transfer documents for our family trust, dated 3 weeks ago. He had been trying to drain our children's future to pay for his new life, but he'd tripped a fraud alert at the bank. I stood there, looking at the man I'd loved for a decade and the girl he'd used to ruin me. They were both staring at me now, the crazy wife who was the only thing standing between them and the ruins of their greed. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a predator. "The accounts didn't freeze because of the bank, Mark," I said, my voice eerily calm as I looked him in the eye. "I moved the money this morning. Every cent of it." Mark's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. He lunged for me, but the sound of heavy tires on gravel stopped him. 2 black SUVs pulled up behind Tiffany's car. Julia had sent her husband's firm's security team. I looked at Mark, then at Tiffany, who was now sobbing on our porch. "The quiet weekend is over," I whispered. Part 4: The Revenge. The silence that followed my confession was heavier than the humid Atlantic air. Mark stood frozen on the porch, his hand still half extended as if he could physically reach out and pull the millions back into his empty accounts. Tiffany, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stopped her sobbing and looked between us, her eyes darting like a cornered animal. She realized in that moment that she wasn't the new queen of a kingdom. She was a witness to a bankruptcy. I stood my ground, flanked by the two security men Julia had sent, feeling a cold, sharp clarity I hadn't felt in years. For the first time in our marriage, I held the remote control, and I was about to change the channel. "You did what?" Mark finally found his voice, but it was thin and reedy, stripped of its usual corporate authority. He stepped toward me, but the larger of the two security guards, a man named Miller, stepped into his path with the silent finality of a brick wall. Mark recoiled, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "That's company money, Sarah. That's my life's work. You can't just move it. That's grand larceny, you crazy bitch." He was screaming now, the composed CEO completely gone, replaced by a man watching his escape hatch weld shut. I didn't flinch at the insult. I'd been called worse by him in the last 48 hours under the guise of medical concern. "Actually, Mark, according to the bylaws of the holding company I helped you incorporate back in our apartment, I'm a 50% stakeholder with full fiduciary access," I said, my voice projecting a calmness that seemed to drive him even deeper into a frenzy. "And since you were attempting to transfer those funds to a non-spouse third party, that would be Tiffany here, without board approval, I simply exercised my right to protect the assets from unauthorized dissipation. My lawyer already filed the injunction an hour ago. The money is in a locked escrow account. No one touches it until a judge decides who actually earned it." Tiffany let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. "You told me she was a bored housewife who didn't know a spreadsheet from a grocery list?" she yelled at Mark, shoving his shoulder. "You told me she was drugged up and delusional. I risked everything for this. My career is over if the firm finds out I was helping you funnel those consulting fees into a private trust." I watched them begin to tear each other apart right there on the cedar planks of our dream home. It was the information hunger I'd been craving, seeing the two of them realize they were both being played by the same man, just in different ways. Mark had promised her a lifestyle he couldn't afford without stealing from me, and he'd promised me a future he'd already sold to her. "Get off my property, Tiffany," I said, my voice cutting through their bickering. She looked at me, her youthful arrogance finally replaced by a flicker of genuine fear. She didn't argue. She grabbed her folder, tripped over her own designer heels, and scrambled back to her little red hatchback. As she peeled out of the driveway, spitting gravel against the side of Mark's SUV, I turned my attention back to my husband. He was panting, his tie askew, looking older than I'd ever seen him. He tried one last play, the Father of the Year card. "Think about the kids, Sarah. If you do this, if you ruin the firm, what do they have left? You're destroying their inheritance out of spite." "I'm saving their inheritance from a man who would trade their college fund for a blonde in a white dress," I countered. I walked past him into the house, signaling for Miller to follow. I went to the safe in the study, the one Mark thought I didn't have the code to, and pulled out the hard drive I'd finished encrypting. I also grabbed the Mermaid's Tear invoice he'd left in the trash like a rookie. I walked back out and stood on the threshold of the home I was about to leave forever. "The locks are being changed in 20 minutes, Mark. I've already moved Leo and Marta to my mother's house. They're safe, they're happy, and they're not going to watch their father treat their mother like a disposable asset anymore." "You won't get away with this," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and desperation. "I'll tell everyone you had a breakdown. I'll have Dr. Aris testify that you were hallucinating the whole affair. I'll bury you in legal fees until you're begging for a settlement." He was still leaning on the gaslighting even now, when the truth was standing right in front of him. It was a sickness, a deep-seated belief that his version of reality was the only one that mattered, but I had one more piece of information to close the loop. "Funny you should mention Dr. Aris," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I called his office this morning. Turns out, he's not a specialist in mental health. He's a concierge physician who specializes in discreetly prescribing sedatives to wealthy wives who ask too many questions. And he was very talkative once I mentioned that the medical board might be interested in his referral fees from men like you. He gave me a very interesting recording of your last consultation, Mark." The one where you asked him how much it would cost to make me comatose enough to sign a power of attorney? Mark's knees actually buckled. He slumped against the railing, the bravado finally draining out of him, replaced by a hollow, gray terror. He realized then that I hadn't just been snooping. I had been conducting a surgical strike. Every lie he'd told me was a breadcrumb I'd followed back to his front door. "Sarah, wait," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "We can talk about this. I'll end it with her. I'll go to therapy. Just don't release that recording. It'll destroy me." "It's not just about the recording, Mark," I said, stepping off the porch and walking toward the SUV Julia had sent for me. "It's about the fact that you thought I was small enough to fit in the box you built for me. You forgot who built the floor of that box." I got into the back seat and looked at him through the tinted glass. He looked small. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life winning, only to realize he'd been playing the wrong game. But as we pulled away, I saw him reach into his pocket and pull out his phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He wasn't calling a lawyer. He was calling someone I didn't recognize. I looked at the folder in my lap, the one Tiffany had dropped. There was a photo inside I hadn't seen. A picture of Mark and a man I knew all too well, the district attorney. They weren't at a fundraiser. They were on a boat, laughing with a suitcase sitting between them. My blood ran cold. The revenge I'd planned was based on the law, but what happens when the man you're fighting owns the people who write it? The hunger for the full truth came back, sharper than ever. I hadn't won yet. I had just started a war I wasn't sure I could survive. The victory I'd felt leaving the Hamptons tasted like ash the moment I saw that photo of Mark with the district attorney. I sat in the back of the speeding SUV, the weight of the folder heavy on my lap, realizing that I'd brought a knife to a gunfight. In Greenwich, the law isn't a set of rules, it's a service you pay for, and Mark had been a premium subscriber for years. My phone buzzed in my hand, a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my mother's driveway in the suburbs, empty and quiet, with a single black sedan parked across the street. No message, just the image. The air in the car suddenly felt thin. He wasn't just coming for my money anymore. He was showing me that my safety was an illusion he could shatter with a single phone call to his friends in high places. I didn't panic. The woman who would have crumbled under that kind of pressure had died on the floor of the country club. I looked at Miller, the security guard, and showed him the photo. "Change of plans," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart. "We're not going to my mother's. We're going to the city." If Mark was going to use his connections to bury me, I had to find the one person he feared more than a judge, his biggest investor, Elias Thorne. Elias was an old-school billionaire who valued legacy and character above all else. He had treated Mark like a son, but he treated the firm's reputation like a religion. Mark's entire empire was built on Elias's capital, and Elias didn't tolerate scandals, especially ones involving embezzled trust funds and drugged-up wives. I spent the next 3 hours in a frantic race against time, while Mark was likely sitting in a wood-paneled office, spinning a tale of my psychotic break to the DA. I was in a dingy 24-hour copy shop, printing out every bank statement, every illicit wire transfer to Tiffany, and the transcript of the recording from Dr. Aris. I felt like a criminal, a fugitive in my own life, but the stakes had shifted from divorce to survival. By midnight, I was standing in the lobby of Elias Thorne's penthouse, my silk dress wrinkled and my spirit frayed. The doorman tried to turn me away, but I held up the mermaid's tear invoice and told him to tell Mr. Thorne that the collateral for the merger was about to be liquidated. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from the most powerful man in the state. Elias listened in total silence as I laid it all out. The affair, the institutionalization plot, and the photo of the DA on the boat. He didn't look shocked. He looked disappointed, the way a gardener looks at a blighted tree. He picked up the photo of the suitcase on the boat and sighed. "Mark always had a talent for shortcuts, Sarah," he whispered. "I just hoped you were the one keeping him on the path." He looked at me, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "What do you want? If I pull my funding, the firm dies. Your kid's inheritance dies with it. Is your revenge worth their future?" That was the moral dilemma I hadn't planned for. I could ruin Mark, but I'd be burning down the house my children were supposed to live in. I looked at the folder, then at the city lights twinkling outside the window. I don't want to ruin the firm, Elias, I said, the words feeling like lead in my mouth. I want him out. I want his shares transferred to a trust for the children, with me as the sole executor. I want a clean break, a full confession to the board, and I want him gone from Connecticut by sunrise. If he refuses, the DA photo goes to the FBI, not the local cops. Elias nodded slowly. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a surgical one. The execution happened in a cold, sterile boardroom at 4 a.m. Mark walked in, expecting to find Elias ready to sign the final merger papers. Instead, he found me, Elias, and a team of corporate lawyers. The look on his face when he saw the documents on the table was the only payment I ever needed. He tried to bluster, tried to call me delusional one last time, but Elias silenced him with a single look. "Sign, Mark," Elias said, "or the FBI is waiting in the lobby. I don't care about your midlife crisis, but I do care about my money being used for bribes and sedatives." Mark looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic pleading, but I didn't feel a spark of pity. I watched him pick up the pen and sign away the life he'd stolen from me. The consequence I didn't plan for came a week later. The firm survived, and Mark vanished to a small town in Florida, but the clean break I wanted was impossible. The scandal leaked, not from me, but from Tiffany, who sold her story to a tabloid the moment her allowance was cut off. My name was dragged through the mud alongside his, the scorned wife whose domestic drama had nearly toppled a tech giant. I went to pick up Leo and Marta from school, and the other moms, the ones I'd organized fundraisers with, turned their backs as I walked by. I had won the war, but I had lost the community I thought was mine. I realized then that the price of exposure wasn't just Mark's career, it was the polished, perfect life I'd spent a decade building. I sat in my new, smaller apartment, watching the sun set over a skyline that no longer felt like it belonged to me. The kids were asleep, finally safe from the shadows of their father's greed. I pulled the mermaid's tear pendant from my bag, the one I'd taken from the house before the locks were changed. It was beautiful, cold, and entirely hollow. I walked to the window and opened it, feeling the bite of the night air. I looked at the diamond one last time, a symbol of everything that had been a lie, and I let it go. I watched it fall into the darkness of the city below, a tiny spark that vanished before it hit the ground. I'm no longer the woman in the silk dress.